Welcome to the Powell-Liberty Historical Society March program. As all of you know, we're still under pandemic restrictions, so we're not able to do these programs face-to-face. But we've been pre-recording and showing them later, which seems to be working. It's not ideal, but it seems to be working. Coincidentally, this program about the Spanish flu, the 1918 pandemic, was scheduled long before we knew we would be living in a pandemic ourselves. So I'm especially happy that we're able to reschedule the program and that Dr. Frasier is able to do it for us. So I'm really happy that we finally will be able to talk about the Spanish flu and the current one. Our speaker, Dr. Frasier, she's a retired physician, having spent 36 years, I think, working, and 22 of those in practice in Sunbury, and worked in clinics in Marysville and Mansfield. Since she retired, she has been volunteering for the Delaware County Historical Society, the League of Women Voters, I believe.
Right.
And what was it, a climate...
Citizens Climate Lobby.
Citizens Climate Lobby, maybe.
And Source Point.
Tell us a little. Oh, and Source Point. So she's been a busy lady since she retired. So I happily turn the program over to Dr. Frasier.
Okay. Thank you, Linda. Thanks for inviting me to do this and keeping after me to do it. Since, as you say, I've been delayed about a year, which means I really have no excuse for not being prepared. The first time I gave this talk was actually 100 years was in 2018, which was the 100th year anniversary of the 1918 flu, and that was to the Delaware Historical Society up in the barn, Stratford Barn. Little did we know at the time what was coming, although experts have been predicting for years that we were going to have another pandemic of some kind. So I'm going to talk about the 1918 Great Influenza, and then just a little bit about COVID and kind of comparing the two pandemics, and then maybe looking ahead for, any lessons we can learn for the future and take any questions you might have. If you want to ask questions as we go along, that's fine too. So in 1918, starting in 1918 and actually lasting until about 1920 or even 21 in some parts of the world, what has been known for many years as the Spanish flu, or the 1918 pandemic began. It began in March of 1918 in Kansas. There was a soldier that was diagnosed with influenza, and at that time, he just appeared to have sort of, garden variety, typical influenza, and some other soldiers did too. It didn't seem that out of line. But what happened was all those soldiers got on ships and went to Europe, and they were all packed in tightly, and they mingled, and they gave each other the flu, and they gave it to the soldiers of the other countries, and so forth. So the virus, it's theorized that the virus mutated and that it became much more lethal. So by August of 1918, when it reappeared in the United States, people were just dropping like flies. As you can see, there were 675,000 deaths estimated in the United States from the 18 flu. The U.S. population at that time was about 100 million. And 50 million deaths worldwide. That's a very kind of rough estimate. It's pretty hard to actually accurately count those. But the population of the world at that time was about 1.7 billion. Now it's 7 billion. So it gives you an idea of the change there. So it was called the Spanish flu, as you probably know, because Spain was neutral in World War I and did not censor its press. And so when reports of the illness appeared in the press, it was just called the Spanish flu, even though it didn't start in Spain, and it was a misnomer, but the name has stuck. It was an H1N1 avian or bird type virus. More people died from influenza than in the First World War, and in only 4 months, 20 million people died worldwide, which is estimated to be about between 2.5% and 5% of the people on Earth at that time. And you can see the hospital just jammed up with cots or beds. I have several pictures that show that kind of thing. Again, lots of beds. The person on the right there is showing the lack of oxygenation or cyanosis, bluish tint to their skin. The most lethal month was the month of September to October, and this shows almost 4,000 deaths in Boston during that time period. And the masking, which of course we're all familiar with now. And there's a poster about it. It tells you how to make a mask. Again, refers to it as Spanish. It's interesting the things they say on here, keep the mouth and nose covered. When a member of the household becomes ill, place them in a room by himself. The room should be warm but well ventilated. The attendant should put on a mask. So really very similar advice, sort of standard public health advice. Here again, just masses of, people sick and on cots or beds. And this really points out how the medical system was completely overwhelmed by this, which is something we've lived through now again. We just aren't geared up to deal with, hundreds and thousands of people getting sick at one time. Churches and theaters and things were closed. One thing that's interesting about this is that there was the same sort of spotty patchwork adherence to public health measures that there is now. Some cities, had a very robust, instructions and people followed them. Other places didn't. Some places the public health officials gave way to pressure by economic considerations, saying, well, you can't close the factory because, of course, we're in the middle of a war too. So they're trying to produce munitions and things like that. So it's in some ways, things don't change a whole lot, it seems like. This just points out the fact that during war, the press was under pressure not to criticize the government, the war effort, and not to publish bad news. So they held back on even printing stories about the flu. And these are more, same public health measures that we talk about today, really, and which are really, quite effective when they're adhered to. This is the same sort of advice. This is a picture of the influenza virus under an electron microscope, which had not been invented at the time of the 18 flu. It wasn't invented until about 1932 or something like that. So the doctors, of course, they had no idea what was causing this. They tried to identify it, and they tried to develop a vaccine for it. And they identified a bacteria which was causing pneumonia in some of these patients, and they thought that was the causative agent, but it wasn't. So of course the serum or vaccine they came up with was not effective. This goes back to the symptoms, coughing up blood. So one of the reasons this was so fatal was that it was very fatal in young people, particularly between the ages of 20 and 40. And it's theorized that young people have a very robust immune system, and that their immune system was too active and they overreacted to this and had what they call cytokine storm, which cytokines are these, inflammatory proteins. This same kind of phenomenon occurs with COVID in some people and in children. Some of the children who've gotten very ill and died have had this kind of the immune system has almost been responsible for their death. They had a shortage of bedding, just like we've had a shortage at times of personal protective equipment. There's a Red Cross fan, playing baseball with masks on. This again shows the death toll worldwide. You can compare it to the 1957 to 58 flu, which was also a pandemic because it went around the whole world, but you can see it's much smaller numbers of people. And the same in 68 and 69. And then we've had other pandemics since.
But of course, did many children get it, and did they close the schools at that time?
They closed the schools. I don't think children were terribly affected. It was more like people in the prime of their life. So a lot of people lost either one or both parents. Their kids were orphaned. When I gave this presentation in Delaware, there was a lady in the audience whose grandmother had died in 1918 flu as a young woman, and left behind like 5 kids or something like that. Yeah, but I don't think children were particularly affected by the 18 one. This is the book on it, although I have to confess I haven't read that. I did use John Barry's book, The Great Influenza, was really my resource, which is a very interesting book and has lots of good detail in it. So why was this flu so deadly? And the main reason was that it was completely new. Nobody had had it before. Even though influenza is a very old disease, and even Hippocrates describes back in 453 BC what modern historians think probably was influenza by the description of the symptoms. But what had happened was, in the Far East, it's not uncommon for people to have birds and pigs and people all living more or less in the same area. And each one of these creatures has influenza virus. And those viruses can migrate from one animal to another. And they say that the pig is actually the perfect mixing vessel for, let's see if I can find that one. Yeah, for these viruses. So they get inside the pig, and it's sort of like a square dance thing, they're touching each other and picking off pieces of protein. And so you come out with a new strain that's completely different that nobody's had. And of course, they don't have any immunity to it. And they theorize that that's what happened in 1918. And this continues to go on in a much more mild way. Like, as every year, when you get your flu shots, they have to make new vaccine every year. And that's because this mixing and matching of viral parts, which influenza is particularly prone to, goes on every year. So they have to make it a little bit better or a little different. So that's called antigenic drift, when you get these small changes. And then shift means you've now gone to a new, much more dangerous strain. So that sets the stage for the epidemic. And then, of course, the war aggravated it with the young men being, going all over the world in close quarters and being in camps in close quarters and on the battlefield. So this is, you can't see this very well, but this is the one where they talk about the Hippocrates describing. It also describes the influenza outbreak in 1889 to 90. So some of the older people in 1918 or 20 would have had the flu probably at this time. So they might have had, I don't know whether they had much protection from it or not, but theoretically they could have. This just describes the symptoms again. So the influenza is, it's not like the 2-day stomach flu. It's not a bad cold. It's like when you get it, it comes on very fast. You feel like somebody punched you, if any of you have had it. Mm-hmm. You don't feel it, you really feel like you've been hit by a Mack truck. This is a little different in contrast to COVID, which seems to be a much more gradual thing, and people can be sick even for a couple of weeks before they get sick enough to be in the hospital. So, and people die mostly from pneumonia from the flu nowadays, and then too as well. But the seasonal flu in this country every year kills somewhere between 12 and maybe as many as 40,000 people. And most of those people die from pneumonia, and they're mostly older or people with who are compromised, have other diseases. But the Spanish flu was much more, as I say, people could get sick in the morning and be dead by evening. I mean, it was just completely overwhelming. And then, as now, there's always somebody seeking to capitalize, make a buck on the situation. I mean, now we've got hydroxychloroquine and bleach and so forth. This is Dr. Mackenzie's smelling bottle. It's probably mostly alcohol. Most patent medicine in those days was alcohol. I thought this was funny. It says Dr. Mackenzie's arsenical soap. Good for the complexion. And so there's a couple articles from the Gazette. Delaware at that time had a paper called the Daily Journal Herald. And this is an article, Influenza Keeps Everybody on the Outlook. And this was also during this time or just after the pandemic that the Delaware Board of Health was first established. And that was common in many places where there had not been one before. So just a little bit of comparison. That picture over there is of course, COVID, which you've seen everywhere in the last year. This is what the influenza diagram of what the influenza virus looks like. So both of them have sort of these same spike features. Both are highly contagious respiratory viruses. And the transmission of both is markedly reduced by mask wearing, social distancing, and hand hygiene. There, of course, was no treatment for pandemic flu, and COVID has many treatments, but not really a specific anti-COVID drug as yet. This is a picture of those refrigerated trucks to put the dead bodies in, because they ran out of morgue space in one of the cities. That's New York City you think of, but they had to be used in other places as well. So the difference is, of course, they're different viruses. The cause of the 18 flu was not known at the time, whereas now we've the scientists figured out within weeks that what virus was and which coronavirus it was, and sequenced the DNA. And so we have all sorts of abilities that we didn't have then. In 18, they did mostly supportive treatment, just fluids, and I suppose they had aspirin then. There weren't many drugs back in 1918. I mean, really proven drugs, as opposed to just, and of course now with COVID, we have oxygen, ventilation, mechanical ventilation, the monoclonal antibodies. We have some broad spectrum antivirals. Medical oxygen actually was developed in the late 1800s, but they didn't have the capacity to actually treat they just didn't, there was no way they had enough to treat all those thousands of people like that. So, can we prepare? Or we can, will we, I guess is really the answer. So we have knowledge and resources really more than any other time in human history. And we know that encroaching on these wild habitats is one cause of animal viruses bridging to human hosts. Not only COVID, but Ebola, and so whether we can, as a world, do something about that, I guess remains to be seen. Human nature, I feel, is our biggest obstacle. With people just get afraid, and there's a lot of denial about what's going on. And I think that's always been true with pandemic, with infectious diseases, and with other threats as well. On the other hand, human nature is a plus in that, humans are very inventive and they're adaptive and resilient, and they can come up with new ideas. So, so let me see if I think I've probably forgotten something. Any questions while I'm taking a look at this? Or comments or additions?
It's interesting, the similarities. I knew that.
Yeah, right.
Even the attitudes and the fear and the denialism.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, and one of the interesting things about the 1918 flu was that people, after it was all over, nobody talked about it or hardly even wrote about it. It was like they just wanted to forget about it and just put it behind them. And I think that's going on now.
Yeah.
People are sick of COVID. They want it over. They want they want to be able to go places and go to restaurants and not wear masks and all that. And
yeah, and probably leadership among the people. I think that's important because
right.
we really had kind of half and half with.
Right.
It's interesting. I was just saying to my husband today. Are you familiar with the website, neighborhood website?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and there was one woman that came on and said her mother was 92 and she doesn't know where to get the vaccine, and like over 100, I'm sure, people gave her answers or places to look, or
oh really?
Yeah. So people are willing to help and do the right thing if we can convince them to do it.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Well, even President Woodrow Wilson had the flu. He went over to France to negotiate the Treaty of Versailles at the end of the war. And he got influenza, and he was actually delirious, apparently. He was really ill. And it's theorized that part of the reason they didn't get a better deal all the way around, especially for like Germany, which, what happened after Germany got shafted, so to speak, on their reparations and all that, was that he was ill. But he never talked about having the flu. He didn't say anything to the nation when he came back.
Right.
it was all sort of swept under the rug. And I don't know what the inclination to do that is, but interestingly enough, former President Trump's grandfather died of 1918 flu.
Is that right?
So Trump's father was only like 13 when that happened.
How long did it take for the 1918 flu to run its course?
About 2+ years. There was a fourth wave that broke out in Australia, I think in 21. Yeah, it took a while.
And then it just stopped.
And then it just stopped, and then by that time I guess it had changed enough that it was more like just kind of a seasonal flu, and just, has stuck around ever since as a seasonal flu with these couple of extra pandemics thrown in. But yeah, it always amazes me in an era where there was no commercial air traffic, this virus went over the whole world, even to remote villages in Alaska. Whole villages died.
It's amazing.
Yeah, it's of course now, we're so mobile that, yeah.
Your comparative pictures that showed the 1918 flu and COVID. I've always wondered, are those little spiky things, do they have a function, or is that just sort of the way it is?
Those are the antigens that, whoops, let me go back to that. Those are the antigens that actually cause the infection. So this is what they produce the antibodies to in the vaccine, and what your own body produces are these spikes. They're protein particles. And the thing about these viruses, and this is true for all viruses, is that they can't live on their own. So they infect whatever they're infecting, whether it's animal, plant, or even bacteria, and they hijack the machinery of the cells and make millions of copies of themselves. And then they move on to the next victim.
Intelligent little things.
Yeah.
They look like little suction cups.
Yeah. So one thing they're trying to do with the flu vaccine is, instead of making antibodies that attack these spikes, is to try to somehow get to the core of it, which doesn't change, because it's the spikes that mutate and change. And so they're trying to develop a flu vaccine that would be then, you could use year after year without having to fool around with it. So
That's interesting. Well, do you suppose we'll learn anything from our experience?
I hope so.
To read.
I hope so. The experts, Bill Gates and people have been predicting pandemics for years. And there have been those movies, which I guess I've never seen, like Outbreak. Have any of you seen?
No, I haven't.
I've never watched any of those, but they're of course meant to, scare you and but the problem with scaring people is that fear is not a very good motivator to get people to do things.
That's true.
You have to come up with solid things they can do to protect themselves, like the public health measures. I mean, the flu season this year has been very minor because so many people are wearing masks and not going out anymore.
Going out.
Right.
Groups.
Yeah. So,
Right.
Exactly.
but
Do you have an explanation for how we managed to get vaccines in very short periods of time when it normally takes 15 years or whatever?
well, one explanation is that this messenger RNA platform apparently has been under development for like a decade. They were trying to develop it to develop a AIDS vaccine, I think. So that's one reason. The other reason that it's way too complicated for me to understand or explain to anybody, but it used to be with the flu vaccine, you have to grow it on eggs, or you have to grow it on culture, and it just takes months to produce, takes a long time to produce. And this new method is way better, but I can't really tell you how it works exactly, so.
I shudder to think what it would be doing now if we didn't have the vaccine.
But you know, people distrust that. I mean, that's one of the
Yes.
first things you hear is it's way too fast. Why was it so fast? They distrust that speed. It is great that they've been able to do
Yeah,
that.
there's a lot of distrust.
Yeah.
And,
But this thing of viruses mixing, and you know, animals and people. Another thing Dr. Berry points out in this book is that in Northern Europe, in the cold winters, people's barns were attached to their houses, and so the animals and the people were all sort of living in pretty close proximity. And they think that that's where smallpox and measles and some of these other viruses that we're familiar with came from, was that they were animal viruses and transmitted to the, to people. When you think about it, the story of humankind is really intertwined with the story of infectious diseases, and the bubonic plague and smallpox and cholera, and some of the same measures were like the quarantine thing that the Italians came up with. That in fact, quarantine I think means 40 days or something. So the idea was if you were isolated for 40 days, then you wouldn't be passing anything on and you'd be safe, so to speak. So that's where that word comes from. And actually influenza itself means, it's an Italian word for influence. So they observed that when people were sick and well people got too close to them, the well people got sick. So they influenced them. So it was influenza. Well, then that was adapted to just refer to this particular illness.
That's interesting.
Yeah, so I thought that was kind of interesting.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that is.
Well, thank you, Dr. Frasier.
You're
This
welcome.
was interesting. We finally, a year later,
A year
a year
later.
and a half later from the time we first communicated about this.
Yeah,
Yeah,
That's
it's
good.
very interesting.
yeah.
That's a food for thought. I think in our generation, we just weren't expecting something like this. It was,
No.
And if it weren't so deadly, it's been actually, it's a terrible time, but it's also an exciting time to be experiencing it.
Because so it is interesting.
It is
I mean, the
interesting.
science of it is interesting.
Yeah.
I'm just sort of, thankful that I'm old enough that I'm not working anymore. And
Yeah.
I feel so badly for those young doctors and nurses in those
yes.
hospitals.
yeah, I do too.
They must all have
Oh dear.
traumatic syndrome. Yeah,
Oh,
it's
they have to,
it's
yeah.
just overwhelming.
Talk about that all the time, don't we?
And also I don't have to get up and go anywhere every day. I don't have to go to work. And,
Yeah, we can,
I send my husband to the grocery store.
and we have plenty of food,
Right.
shelter, and,
Right. I mean,
All
we're
of
just
those
extremely fortunate. And,
right?
oh, boy. But our kids, we have school-age grandchildren, and boy, it's tough. Their parents
Oh,
are
yeah.
just,
I'm sure.
it's just a real challenge to,
Yeah.
Yeah, what do they do?
Yeah.
There's a teacher across the street from me. She works in Columbus, but she does, I guess they're doing a lot of teaching from home still. Anyway, before they went back to school, they formed some groups where some would babysit at the end of the day, or some would do the teaching for their kids, and so some days I see like 15 kids in her yard. So she must be her day.
Her day, yeah.
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 And when you think about little kindergartners and first graders, they've had no normal school experience. in their life.
None.
No.
None. We have one granddaughter in Worcester, Ohio. She's 5, so she's started kindergarten this year, and the whole thing has been this strange conglomeration of, hybrid and being home. wearing a mask. And of course, to her, it's just, this is the way it is, you know, it's just normal. But and the college kids, I think it's very hard on them.
Oh, yeah,
It's
it
just-
has to be.
Yeah.
Yeah.